Okay, so I'm Annette Hilton.
I'm Geoff, and we're in Byron Bay, Australia, and we're in lockdown, and we've also just had 2 days of torrential rain, so we're sitting at home.
So we're very happy to have something to do this afternoon, and that is to talk to you about the contribution of individual practitioner research to school improvement. We've conducted a multiple case study, and today we're going to do a quick overview of the study and present some case studies to illustrate what we've been finding out. So the background to the research, we're still learning about Screencastify, you can tell, is that a lot of the research around practitioner research focuses on the individuals that are conducting the research and what the impacts are for them. So, for example, professional growth, improved classroom practice, improved empowerment, and so on. More recently, there's been a focus on the effects of practitioner research on school improvement, but there hasn't been so much research published about it. So we've started recognising that that is happening with the practitioner researchers that we work with in schools, and we were interested in finding out a little bit more about how that research has impacted beyond the researcher.
And so Annette and I have been responsible over the last few years for mentoring some practitioner researchers. So these researchers, they choose their own topics, and then they usually spend a year investigating that topic, and we're there to mentor them along the way and give them a hand. At this stage, we've done 15 primary schools and secondary schools in Australia, and we're up to 77 school leaders, curriculum leaders and classroom teachers, and we've got 62 year-long projects now. 62 and 77 doesn't match because sometimes people work in groups of 2 or even groups of 3 to do their research.
And we should say those are completed, 62 completed projects. This year's projects are ongoing and are a little more challenging because of COVID, but that's for another time. So we've been collecting data around the outcomes of practitioner research now for 4 years, and we've used a combination of open response survey questions and semi-structured interviews to collect those data. We've collected them from the participants, whether they're classroom teachers or school or curriculum leaders, and we've also collected data from school leaders who haven't participated in our program but whose teachers have. And what we've therefore come up with is a huge bank of data, and we looked at each of those projects as an individual case study, and then did a cross-case analysis to figure out what are these key outcomes from the projects to try and categorise them. That table is a quick snapshot summary of what we found. So it's very difficult to say this project had outcomes for the classroom and that project had outcomes for the school. They're very much an overlap, but what we found was that there are basically 4 categories of outcome, and those outcomes are linked to classroom-based outcomes, student-centred outcomes, school-wide impacts, and also some outcomes that have gone beyond the school. You can see in the second column of that table, each of those main outcome categories has subcategories within them. And then on the right-hand side, we've put a quick example of each from different projects that teachers and school leaders have conducted over the course of the study.
So let's have a look at a couple of case studies. The first one was a really interesting one. It was enhancing children's gross motor skills. There were 2 physical education teachers in far north Queensland up in Cairns, and they noticed that they had a number of very young students who were performing below age equivalent in physical education. Things like, I think they couldn't bounce a ball or couldn't hop. It's fairly straightforward things you'd expect 6-year-olds to be able to do. Anyway, what they did with their research was that they found a tool that had been validated in other research where they were able to evaluate all of their students with some of these basic physical activities. And this identified those below age equivalent children. They then designed a targeted program which they implemented over 2 school terms, which nominally might be 20 weeks, but they got interrupted no end. So I think they only actually had 8 weeks hands-on.
8 weeks of targeted intervention time.
Yeah. And so they worked with these young students, and they, at the end, they post-tested them using the evaluation tool again, and they all had gained at least age equivalents, and some of them had gone beyond age equivalent after 8 weeks of targeted intervention from the phys ed teachers. So it was a really good outcome. And the outcomes were the principal, realising that there was a bit of a problem there, guaranteed 1 hour per week for physical education. So he funded that. Also employed an additional physical education teacher to ensure that people were able to put the skills into these students, not just those initially targeted, but more broadly. And another little interesting outcome, a little twist, was that the school district physiotherapist became very interested in what the teachers were doing to assist these below age equivalent students. And so those were the outcomes. The classroom impact, of course, is that school now has a targeted program for students who might be below age equivalent. The student-centred impact, the students obviously received the targeted teaching strategies and the activities. There were school-wide impacts with the change in staffing and timetabling. And of course, the beyond school impact in this case was that the physiotherapist was very keen and was taking some of those ideas beyond that particular school to assist students in other schools.
The second case study is from another primary school, this time a primary school in Brisbane, where 3 classroom teachers, one from each of grades 3, 4 and 5, so children who are 8, 9, 10, they were very interested in determining whether or not using targeted feedback would help their children improve their writing. So they conducted a fairly extensive literature review to learn more themselves about different kinds of feedback and things that might be appropriate for children in mid to upper primary school. And they used that to develop their own feedback model. They taught their students how to give, receive, request, and use that feedback. And there were 4 different feedback types that you can see there. So the children became familiar with not only what did those different kinds of feedback mean and look like, but they were able to ask for which kind of feedback they felt helped them the most and give it to others.
And different grades wanted different feedback. It was really interesting.
Different grades preferred. The younger ones liked the corrective and affirming feedback. The older ones liked the suggestive feedback to help them to make improvements.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
So they found that this explicit feedback did enhance their students' writing and their understanding and use of feedback. So they initially only wanted to know what it did for the students' writing, but they discovered that the students became quite adept at using and receiving and giving feedback. So the outcomes from that were that those teachers developed a feedback model which was then rolled out across other classrooms in their school. They created workshops as professional development for their colleagues, and the whole school has now adopted those feedback approaches. So you can see that the classroom impact has been the feedback model, and the student-centred impact is obviously enhancing students' writing skills and their response to feedback. The school-wide impact has been that the school now has a consistent approach to writing instruction and has a bank of professional learning resources associated with that. And beyond the school, those teachers have shared their findings with school principals across the district. They also shared them in a bigger forum where they created posters and talked about their findings to other teachers and other schools.
So this one was an interesting one from a high school, re-engaging Indigenous students through virtual reality. And this one was done by a head of department at a school that had a particularly high Indigenous population. And he realised that his Year 8 class, which in this case were all Indigenous girls, there were issues with disengagement and low attendance at school. So in an attempt to correct that problem, he decided to try to get some funding for some virtual reality equipment, which he was successful doing. And then he was using that virtual reality equipment to help the students engage in global contexts But more interestingly, they also were able to use the VR for recording some of the local sacred sites. So he actually engaged with the elders of the Indigenous community and got permission to go in and film the sacred sites in the area, and then use that in class with students. And they connected it with writing and so on. And so the outcomes of this project was that they obviously developed some VR resources for language and also for history. And there's a very valuable now recording of sacred sites in the area. So the tailored materials and resources and physical tools from the VR are now embedded in the school. And what was really interesting was that, remembering the initial goal was to address the disengagement and low attendance, they found that there has been improved engagement and improved attendance. But some other ones that they weren't expecting was an increase in empathy. The young girls were able to display far more empathy than previously, and also obviously they enjoyed it, and they had increased access to technology. So pretty good all round outcome from them on.
And much beyond what was initially expected. And the empathy, the explanation that we came up with, or that researcher came up with, was that students had become immersed in contexts that they were not familiar with. And so suddenly, because they were more familiar and had an understanding of different contexts, they were able to engage with their English subject matter and be more empathetic and more understanding. It was a great project. The final case study that we've got to share with you is from a pair of grade 1 teachers who were very concerned that right from the start of the year, their children lacked resilience, gave up easily. I can't do that. I'm not doing it. Put their hands up the instant they were given a task, just gave up on things. And these teachers felt really frustrated that children so early in their schooling were so quick to give up on what they were asked to do. So they decided to devise a program to work with the children to train them to use the power of self-talk. And their work was based on Carol Dweck's growth mindset work. And they focused a lot on really simple things like the word yet. I can't do this yet, with the expectation that if I keep trying, I will be able to do it. So they implemented their intervention program over 2 school terms, and they kept classroom observations of the children, and they also surveyed the parents, and also not listed there, but they got a lot of anecdotal reports from the parents as well. And their results showed that the students' willingness to persist and to try challenging tasks did improve over the course of time. It was slow, but they got there. And the students' ability to identify and use positive language definitely improved. And parents were saying, I don't know what you're doing, but my child at home is picking me up when I don't use positive language or when I don't show a growth mindset. Yeah. So it was quite powerful in the end. And so the outcomes of this project, beyond just helping those 2 classrooms of children, were the development of classroom-ready resources for other teachers. So these teachers had a whole lot of activities, discussion topics, posters, physical resources. The approaches have been adopted across other year levels because the question from their colleagues was, well, what happens when these grade 1s go into grade 2? So it's been adopted throughout the school. And those teachers have since published a book for other teachers to use, teachers who are interested in doing more along this same line. So the classroom impact was the development of the resources and the activities. The student-centred impacts were enhanced growth mindsets and improved willingness to persist with those children. Beyond the school, there are now published materials, strategies. I think there's also a website as well. So those teachers have just sort of kept growing this thing mainly in response to their colleagues' demands. And then beyond the school as well, they've spoken to pre-service teachers and they run workshops across their school district for teachers in other schools as well.
Yep. Very effective.
So you can see just from that brief chat and those 4 case studies that there are a lot of diverse outcomes. Clearly, there are a lot of outcomes for the individual researchers, and they do learn a lot and they do see the impacts of what they've done on their students, which is the motivator to begin with. But the impacts go beyond the researcher. There are classroom-related impacts. There are, obviously, you'd hope, impacts related to the students. But the school-wide and beyond school impacts for us have been the things that weren't necessarily predicted from the outset.
Yep. They're powerful.
They were very powerful. They, I suppose, in some ways underline the importance of asking practitioners to disseminate their research, because those changes across the school and beyond wouldn't have happened if the school leaders hadn't heard what the outcomes were, and if the teachers' colleagues hadn't heard what they were and were prepared to run with it and be involved and accept it going beyond those initial teachers.
That's our time up.
That's our time up.
Hopefully see you next year.
See you in the future at BERA, and thank you for listening.